Okay, well, it's now just ticked over to the afternoon, so good afternoon, everyone. Most of the speakers that have come before me have talked a lot about why it's important that we protect our maritime trade. So if you forgive me, I'm going to just skim through some of the earlier slides and get to the ones at the back, which really talk about what I consider to be some of the current and emerging risks to maritime trade and some of the potential options for protecting that trade. So the bottom line up front, as we've discussed, our prosperity and indeed our capacity to function are reliant on maritime trade, but in a time of conflict, so too our ability to successfully prosecute and wage war ourselves. As a consequence, the ADF has an obligation to consider the risks to the free flow of trade and to develop plans to mitigate these risks. You've seen slides or variants of this this morning, but I think it demonstrates nicely the Indo-Pacific sea lines of communication, but really from our perspective, it demonstrates where we sit as that sort of fulcrum between the Indian and Western Pacific Oceans, and through an area which has significant choke points and constraints upon it, but also where we've heard earlier an enormous amount of the world's national wealth is generated. So this slide here, from a national security perspective, there are several vital slocks that assure our energy supplies, and I sort of characterise them in three ways. The first of those through the Indian Ocean to the west, which are principally about energy. Then there are those to the north, which are principally engaged with our major trading partners in North Asia, both in terms of the export of commodities and the import of manufactured goods. And then one that doesn't get discussed as often but is very important from a maritime ops planner's perspective is that vital arterial between Australia and our main ally through the Western Pacific and through the South Pacific Island nations. So while that may not have the same immediate commercial value, in a time of conflict, that would be one that we would seek to secure, but also one where a potential adversary might seek to compromise. You'll note that I haven't included more distant choke points such as the Straits of Hormuz or the Bab el-Mandeb or even the Taiwan Straits with the circles where I've highlighted what are natural choke points. And the reason for this is that while Australia will naturally contribute to the protection of maritime trade, our role is almost certainly going to be a supporting one. The ones that I've highlighted there are ones which will very much be at front and centre of Australian maritime planner's mind, and one where our allies and partners might expect us to take naturally a leadership role. I should add that these maritime sea lines of communication and choke points are not just commercial in our minds, but also in military terms. In a campaign sense, with a nod to Corbett, any decisive or culminating phase of a conflict generally requires some sort of land element at its conclusion, which means troops and their accompanied stuff needs to be supported into the area of operations. And naval officers, and particularly submariners like myself, are frequently surprised about just how much stuff our counterparts in the other domains need to sustain any degree of conflict. For those of us who take our stuff with us, we can sometimes forget just how much stuff is required. And I can assure you that even in a limited conflict, it's mind-blowing just how much equipment, stores, people and supplies need to be sent forward. And of course, people coming back, casualties potentially. And even across any of the sort of military construct, there are simply not enough ships to be able to do that or enough aircraft. So maritime trade is going to have a role in the event that things end up deteriorating to that situation. I'm just going to skim through this slide. This really just reminds us that all of this is about sustaining the nation, and that, as has been said by others, that not only by volume but also by value, much of our national prosperity and survival requires sea trade. Potential disruptions to maritime trade. With maritime trade so critical to our prosperity, it can be disrupted by a wide range of factors. These include things like severe weather events, which are increasing as we know, and the targeting of trade by non-state actors such as violent extremist groups, pirates, etc. These factors are well familiar to this audience and serve as an important bridge for a wide range of states to cooperate. Counter-piracy in the Gulf of Aden is but one example. I would, however, like to focus more on state-based disruption, which could emerge as a greater threat where state competition has increased globally, and there are a number of new mechanisms which states might employ to disrupt trade to their advantage, particularly in the space of areas such as space, cyber and information warfare domains. The last couple of slides I just want to talk about define what I describe as a scale. The first one is a scale of state-sponsored scalable disruption. As depicted on this slide, the mechanisms for states to disrupt maritime trade are scalable and can range at the left of arc for things like political options. These are things like increased bureaucratic impediments to moving things through ports, the declaration of additional reporting and control requirements, or even the state sponsoring of things like strike action at ports. So these are mechanisms that are relatively easy for states to put into place, but considerably slow and stifle the free movement of trade. We see then as we move through into the centre what those kind of grey zone options, including non-attributable cyber operations, the use of militia or proxy forces and the like to coerce shipping and essentially drive things like insurance costs up and make it very, very expensive for shipping companies to conduct their trade. Finally, at the right of the scale, should a state have sufficient capacity and intent, they could declare exclusion zones or blockade vital slots. This is an expensive and resource-intensive option and can also very quickly escalate into a full conflict scenario. I would say, however, that emerging technologies including unmanned aerial and undersea systems such as gliders, UAVs, as we've seen in the Middle East recently, the proliferation globally of ballistic missiles, etc., increase the range of denial options to a state beyond the traditional ones such as submarines, surface ships and military aircraft. So the opportunities for states to be able to potentially disrupt or declare these kind of exclusion zones in there near abroad has increased beyond those great powers because of the range of options available to states to do so. Moving now on to how we might protect maritime trade. I'm going to probably leave you with as many questions as answers, and I'd ask most of you to ponder this, particularly some of our junior officers and junior sailors in the audience, because there will be a problem that you will need to be thinking about much over the next couple of years. Without going into the operational details, there's a similarly scalable range of options for states to respond to disruptions to maritime trade. Several of these mechanisms are already in place at the peacetime end of the scale to maintain matters at that end, with a very clear intent, such as engagements through ports with our maritime trade officers and NCAGs, through maritime domain awareness through international fusion centres and multilateral maritime coalitions such as CMF. So all of these things are ongoing all the time, and navies around the world and coast guards and others contribute to this to try and keep things at that left of arc. It is, however, the responsibility of all militaries to develop contingency plans should these mechanisms fail, including some of the options listed at the right of the scale, including the establishment of joint or combined task forces to coordinate multi-domain solutions to assure the safe passage of shipping, potentially through the establishment of safe zones, and as we've heard before, what might be modern variants of escort and convoy. It's worth reminding ourselves that maritime trade does not stop in a time of conflict, and indeed, as we've already discussed with many of the presenters today, becomes even more important, such that the conflict can be won and brought to the swiftest conclusion as possible. While it's apparent to maritime operations planners that all of the range of solutions and operational plans requires multi-domain solutions via an integrated joint force, a consideration that navies remain the main or single arbiter of protection of maritime trade is fundamentally flawed. In the Australian context, things like the Joint Operations Centre, where I work out at HQ JOC, and then the establishment of joint task forces, or increasingly now more joint interagency task forces, to bring together a whole range of stakeholders to be able to protect maritime trade, is going to be essential, irrespective of what part of this scale you're on. Finally, I'll leave you with a few questions to ponder. I finish on this slide because discussions about the range of emerging threats to maritime trade and the potential scale of these risks, should they be realised in a globalised world, really do leave us with a lot of questions. They also leave many of us with considerations regarding how states can independently and collectively respond to challenges in an era where the ratio of global merchant traffic to warships is very different to what it is with that picture. Looks like Bedford Basin there, where the convoys were sort of assembled. So, you know, if you go back to World War II, there was many fewer merchant ships compared to warships. Now, you know, warships are becoming more sophisticated and expensive. So even while there is somewhat of a naval build-up going on in the Asian region, there are still far less warships today than there were then. And there are many, many more merchant ships, as you've heard. So the way in which we might be able to assure that trade is not going to be the same as what it was circa World War I or even in World War II. So I'll leave you with those questions to consider. Thank you.